In this video, I want to work through a rather more complex example of a nested loop in order to see some of the implications and use cases for running a nested loop example. Imagine we have received this question. We want to write a program that will receive a number that says the number of students in a class from the end user. We also want to receive the number of tests per student, and then what we want to do is that we want to run a program that goes through these values one by one, so number of tests per student, and receives the values and prints out an average score for each student. So if I want to summarize it, we want to get a number of student and test scores from a student, and then we want to determine each student's average test score and then display those values. So let's say if we run the code, this would be the output that we want to see. Let's say I want to see how many students we have. I'm going to say 3 students and 3 test scores per student. And then the program will ask for student number 1, test number 1. I'm going to say, let's say 10, test number 2, 15, and test number 3, 20. And should give us the average for student number. So it says the average for student number 1 is 15, and then it will continue the process until we have covered each student and their averages. Okay, so let's see how we can write a program like this. Okay, to tackle this problem, first thing first, we want 2 variables that will basically receive the number of students in class. I'm just gonna write these quick. So give us an input, and then we will have the number of tests per student, basically another value. Let's say how many tests per students in class. And then once we have those values, so this is the first thing, we want an input, get the number of students and test scores. Now, in order to simplify this question, the first step that I usually do is to start forming the inner loop. The inner loop in this case is calculating the average score for one student. Once we have that code, we can always extend that code in order to include the outer loop. Basically repeat that process for number of students. So in order to do this, I'm going to have a total score, which is going to be our accumulator variable for each student, and I'm going to say print, let's say run, let's say for test in range test number. What we want to do, basically repeat certain steps. For instance, I want to print a statement that says test number, and then I want to say test number, and then we want to have the test that basically receives the test scores. So we want to say receive this, and I also want to add a column at the end of this. So we say for each receive a score, and then the score would be an integer. Let's just round these numbers to integer, assuming that all the values are in integer, and we can say just the input. So if I'm running this, I can just turn it into hashtag because we're only interested in the outer loop. Let's see if that works. How many test scores? 2. So we have test number. Because it starts with 0, let's just add 1 value to this. So our range starts with test number 1. Let me run this again. How many test scores per student? I'm going to say 2. This is where I'm putting the value. Run it again. How many test scores per student? 2, and I have test number 1, and I'm receiving test number 2. So that part, it looks like it's working. So now once I have this, I need to increase my accumulator variable with the total score. So every score that you get, you're increasing that value. And last, once you have all these numbers, you can just calculate the average. I would say the average is equal to the total divided by the number that we have received here. So it's going to be divided by test num, and then we can say print the average is average. Okay, so let's test our code again. How many test scores? We say 2. Test number 1, I'm going to say 10. Test number 2, 12. And the average is 11. So looks like this part of the work, which was the inner loop, it's working well. Now what we need to do, we want to now add the second part, which was the outer loop, and run this process for number of students. So here I'm receiving the student number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say for student in range student number, and what we want to do is we want to do certain statements. First of all, the total was 0, so we keep that. But what we need to do, we need to indent each. I also want to say print student number, and then print the number. Let's say student, and then what we're gonna do, we're gonna start collecting values. So again, because the range starts from 0, we want to print student plus 1. So basically the first student, instead of being a student 0, it's going to be called a student 1. So we can run this part. Let's test it out. How many students? 2. How many test scores? 2. And we're going to say student number 1 is student number 2. Now this is now what we want. So we want to basically put everything within that loop. So that means we need to indent this, make sure everything runs within that for loop. So we have all the averages, and what we can do is I can also print an empty line after each student. And finally, once the process is done, I'm gonna say the process is done. So let's test this code again. How many students do you have? I'm going to say 3. How many test scores? 2. And now we see that we have a student number 1, test number 1. I'm going to say 10, and then 12. And the average was calculated, so the average is 11. Now a student number 2 and test number 1, I'm going to say 15, and then 18. And the average for this student is 16.5, and it will do the same for the third student because we said we have 3 students. So I'm going to say 20, 22, and we will see the value, and then finally it will get out of those nested loops and will say the process is done. So this is basically how we can tackle a complex question like the one we just discussed.